Let's go ahead and make your three-page report Exhibit 2 and your short note Exhibit 3.
Let me note my objection since that wasn't done for the purposes of diagnosis and treatment. It's an excluded hearsay document.
Did you prepare your report to memorialize your opinions based on your review of the records and films in this case?
Yeah.
And I'm going to be asking you some questions about your report. In a couple of places, you indicated that you believed it would not be beneficial to physically examine Mr. Crawford. Can you explain your thought process there?
Well, I think you had specifically asked me or had mentioned in your report, I don't know that we've ever talked before this, but mentioned something about additional input from either videotapes of current activities or the additional insight that might be generated from a clinical exam. The only reason I was not enthusiastic about that is that it would be obvious that I wouldn't be treating this patient, that he'd had extensive treatment from orthopedics, I think neurology, ophthalmology, and neurosurgery. No one had documented a surgical issue here, and having perused the medical records already about what had been done, it was pretty obvious to me that there wasn't really a serious structural substrate here that was treatable. In other words, there was a feeling that there was perhaps a concussion, cervical discomfort, low back discomfort. The relevant neurodiagnostics were done, and really nothing was found substantial. And under that circumstance, 6 months, a year, even longer after the accident, I'm not sure that I have anything to offer under that circumstance. And looking at a videotape of somebody walking around perhaps, or playing touch football, or standing on their head, no matter what it is, just walking into the store, for instance, doesn't really give one any additional information over and above what's already rendered in the reports, at least in my opinion. So I certainly wasn't anxious to put the patient through yet another interview with yet another consultant when I felt that the yield would be relatively low. On the other hand, I'm perfectly willing to accept the fact that someone who's visited with a patient numerous times on numerous occasions gets a better sense or flavor, if you will, about their complaints and their subjective problems in a case like this. I'm not sure they know much more than anyone else would about the objective findings in terms of the imaging studies and other neuroddiagnostics.
You've mentioned a couple of concepts.
I wanted to just touch
Sure.
on one thing here, and I wanted to be sure. This accident was quite some time ago. I think it was in October 2000, if I'm not mistaken.
2002.
So we're talking 4 years later. I mean, it's not going to really be useful for me to examine somebody in this kind of scenario 4 years after the accident. Now, if you saw them 2 weeks or even 2 months afterwards, you might be able to offer either help to the person or any other interested parties about your thoughts. But I don't think examining them would have helped.
Would the same hold if it was 2 years after the accident?
Sure. I mean, like I said, a couple of months, something with a reasonable hiatus. But if you're talking years after a motor vehicle accident, which, as far as I know, there were no external signs of trauma, and then all the neuroddiagnostics were essentially negative for any surgical problem, I'm not sure that I would have had that much more to contribute.
Now, you mentioned the word that there were no substrates in Mr. Crawford's case based on your review. Could you tell us what you mean?
Well,
by
I think what I meant by that was, something that could be logically or rationally inferred to be causing focal or lateralizing neurologic signs or symptoms. In other words, if I look through these notes, there's headache, cognitive problems, back pain, left hip pain, leg radiation. I believe elsewhere in here there's neck pain.
You're referring to whose notes now?
Those were Dr. Everett Howell's notes. Then there's some additional material in here about pain in the middle of the night, awakening from sleep, limiting in his activities. Here he's got a full range of motion at the neck, limitation in the back, some spasms, positive stretch maneuvers here. Much of this is relatively straightforward and persistent through the different exam dates. Here he's got bilateral leg pain, and Dr. Howell notes that he's got mild to moderate spinal stenosis, no instability, disc bulging. I see anything additional there that would make me feel there was some substrate that I could go back in time and say that a car accident caused. In other words, car accidents don't cause disc bulges and don't cause spinal stenosis. Now, they may cause headaches, and I suppose they may cause some cognitive difficulties if somebody has a concussion.
Now, you mentioned the distinction between subjective and objective in your discussion a minute ago. What's the difference between that for the jury's benefit?
Well, again, the objective findings would be some specific focal neurologic finding, loss of reflexes, loss of some cranial nerve function, weakness in a particular major muscle group that was reproducible, correlated with neurodiagnostic study evidence of a problem like a ruptured disc, something causing neural impingement, a stroke that we could relate to some particular traumatic event, say in this case. Subjective symptoms would be much of what I'd just been describing: headache, sleeplessness, neck pain, back pain, left leg pain, right leg pain, hip pain, all of those sorts of things. Cognitive difficulties can also be, I suppose, described as subjective.
And is it correct that you, while you didn't believe it was beneficial to examine the patient or see a video of his current activities, that you did ask for the diagnostic films to review?
Right. Again, I didn't feel that videotapes or necessarily examining him 4 years after an accident was going to be all that productive. The imaging studies, I think, were relatively, I mean, they're a moment in time that's captured on film, if you will. So I think that's something that might be useful to evaluate.
Okay. Now, when you treat patients that have the same or similar symptoms as Mr. Crawford, can you give us a time period when you would typically release that patient after an accident like this?
Again, I'm surmising because all of the details are not perfectly known to me, but typically in patients such as this that I've seen, and obviously there are quite a number of them, generally I will follow them for a couple of months. Unless I can turn up something of a neurosurgical nature, I feel like I'm basically wasting those patients' time. Now, that's not always the case, obviously, and I'm not suggesting that this was the case with Dr. Howell, but my philosophy about that is I'm going to look for something neurosurgical in nature. If I can find something specifically related to the issues at hand that I can help the patient with, then I will obviously continue to see them. For these kinds of problems, generally after a couple of months, I will tend to turn someone loose.
And did you see any problems of a neurosurgical nature on Mr. Crawford's objective diagnostic studies?
Well, I think the mild spinal stenosis might have been something to be aware of or at least address, which I think was addressed. I think that would be considered of neurosurgical nature. Otherwise, the concept that he suffered a concussion would be obviously of neurosurgical interest. In terms of the rest of the diagnostic studies, I don't think there was anything that showed up.
Okay. Was there anything on his diagnostic studies that wouldn't be found in an asymptomatic individual?
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, concussions are not typically considered asymptomatic individuals. I mean, I think it's reasonable to presume that he may have had a concussion either with or without loss of consciousness in this accident. That's not unreasonable. The disc bulging is something that you could see in an asymptomatic person or a symptomatic person, perhaps, depending on the degree of spinal stenosis. The degree of spinal stenosis I saw in this imaging study really didn't impress me as something that I thought ought to be symptomatic. In other words, I think there are other issues in patients such as this that would often cause back pain, hip pain, and leg pain with that kind of an imaging study. Typically, that's musculoligamentous. It may be related to deconditioning, obesity, things of that nature, in addition to being in a car wreck.
The very second to last paragraph of your report says, quote, "This man was engaged in primarily sedentary office-type work, and it is mystifying why he would be incapacitated for over 6 months. A month would be a long time, in my opinion," end quote. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, outside of any cognitive difficulties, I'm not sure I would understand that. Now, again, I think you have to be informed here that I've not examined this person. There may well have been excellent reasons that he was unable to function for extended periods of time. Based on these reports and the imaging studies, it would be a puzzle to me. In other words, if you had serious cognitive difficulties, and this is a little bit out of my sphere of work. I mean, somebody with neuropsychometrics might be more knowledgeable, but if you were unable to document some serious intracranial injuries on imaging studies and something really substantive in psychometrics, then I don't understand why you can't do desk work for 6 months with this clinical scenario. That seems something beyond what I would typically expect. Now, there may have been some extenuating circumstances. I just didn't see it.
Okay. Are you aware of any documented cognitive difficulties?
Well, I think there's mention of it in Dr. Howell's notes. He's talking about, it says here, in February '03. Now, this is 3 years after the accident, if I'm not mistaken. It says he has done better as far as headache and cognitive problems. It says he's still now having problems with muscular ligamentous and back and hip and so on. So he must have mentioned some cognitive issues. Headaches, I'm sure, would probably have impacted to some extent on the type of work he does. I believe he's an architect.
But you're not aware of any psychometric evaluations of the type you mentioned?
I'm not aware of them, but even if they were done, I wouldn't be able to interpret them for you or be considered expert in them because I don't do that kind of work.
Okay.
I'm just saying if you had psychometrics and you showed serious cognitive difficulties in someone who was a professional, an architect, an attorney, a doctor, in any number of walks of life, you could make the case that that person could not work for 6 months.
But that wouldn't be a neurosurgical issue.
Right, but what I'm saying is, as a neurosurgeon, if I was evaluating a patient like this and there was some compelling case that this person couldn't think or couldn't function because of headaches, then I would be more accepting of the concept of being unable to do any kind of work for 6 months after a car accident like this. On the other hand, looked at dispassionately, as I said, as far as I know, the car accident didn't cause fractures of long bones. It didn't obviously cause any structural abnormalities in the lumbar imaging studies or a head scan. I would be hard-pressed to explain why years after an event someone would be unable to function, or 6 months later.
And low back pain, would that be associated with any headaches?
Well, low back pain is a different symptom. I mean, low back pain is low back pain. Headaches are headaches. I mean, you could have both, one or the other.
But
I mean, I've seen all of that after car wrecks. 6 months later, I would expect that to have dissipated quite some time before. It doesn't always, but I don't know that any of us has a rational explanation for that, barring something on the imaging studies or clinical exam that's really specific.
That same paragraph, the second to last of your report, also states, I cannot understand the rationale for any further treatment whatsoever. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's been 4 years.
Now, you say that, but I want to make sure you understand that the accident was 10/25/02.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, it's been 2 years. So is that a typo on my part?
It may be.
It may be a typo. I apologize.
That's all right.
At any rate, it's been years. And I think everything that can be done has been done. So I don't know what else to do. As I said, in individuals like this, it doesn't seem unreasonable to me to follow them, get them some physical therapy, obtain all of the necessary neurodiagnostics, consultants if those are necessary. If you can't demonstrate a substantial underlying substrate for this, what else is there to do? The use of COX-2 inhibitors indefinitely now that's probably a moot point, since most of those have either been taken out of the market or people are concerned about them in one way, shape, or form or another about other side effects. But obviously the issue of using long-term anti-inflammatory agents, narcotics, or muscle relaxants is